Alright, in this video we're going to walk through the installation steps for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator Kit on the 2024 KTM Duke 390. Let's quickly review what's included in the Fender Eliminator Kit. So there's going to be the Fender Eliminator body and then a hardware kit. And in the hardware kit it's going to be a pair of zip ties, a pair of rubber bumpers to help install into the license plate flange and minimize license plate buzzing or vibration, a rubber grommet to seal out the hole the wire pass through, a zip tie mount to pop in and help contain some of your wiring, 4 aluminum CNC machined aluminum spacers to help mount the Fender Eliminator, and then 6 locking M6 nuts. And so those are going to be 4 for the Fender Eliminator and an extra set of 2 to complement the factory hardware to mount your license plate. So as for the Fender Eliminator body itself, it's proudly made here in the US from a single piece of CNC laser cut and formed 1/8 inch thick aluminum. It's powder coated in a UV resistant satin black powder coat, so it matches the factory finish extremely well. And as you can tell, it's got a lot of kind of complicated cutouts, and that all comes from a laser scan of the motorcycle. Helps us build a piece that's unique to the Duke 390 or the 2024 Duke 390, and it fits extremely nicely. Included in that Fender Eliminator are 4 pressed-in PEM studs, and so there's no exposed hardware from the underside of the motorcycle. And it is set up to run the factory KTM turn signals and the factory KTM license plate light. So it is got full DOT compliance in terms of swapping over the existing lights. So it's a plug-and-play installation. Tools you'll need for the installation include Phillips head screwdriver, a ratchet with 10 and 8mm sockets with an extension are going to be necessary, 4mm Allen key or a 4mm Allen driver, 14mm open-end crescent wrench, a pair of pliers and a 14mm deep socket, or a 14mm slotted socket if you have one, a pair of flush cutters or dikes or snips. And it is useful to use a pick and a magnetic pickup tool for this installation, but not required. I'm going to use a power driver for some of that, but that's not required either. First step is going to be to use the key to pop the passenger seat. It's just going to use the key to pop the latch and slide the seat forward. Then we're going to disconnect this 4-pin wiring connector by lifting the tab on the female part of the shell and pulling out the connector. Not entirely necessary, but it will make it a little easier, just a little more access if you pop the rider seat as well, which is just lifting it off its back pedestals and scooching it backwards. Set that aside. Next, going to remove 2 black rubber plugs that are covering 2 of the fender holes. You can use your fingernail or a pick to lift them out. Removing the rider seat does give you a little bit more access with the second hand to help the removal, and if they roll down forward, easier to grab. There's going to be 4 10mm head hex bolts, and 2 of them will be easy to get to that are clearly visible, and the other 2 you need either an extension or a big T wrench like this to go through the subframe hole and remove them. And you don't have to pull them out just yet. Be a little easier once the fender comes out. You'll feel them go totally loose, but you can leave them in their little holes for now. They will get taken out and not reused, but try not to let them go rattling down the subframe of the bike. So these back 2, you can readily get them with your fingers as they go loose. And as you loosen the last one, you'll see the fender start to wobble. So with one hand, hold the fender and take it out. Once the fender's off, you can readily go grab those bolts with the magnet. You can definitely fish them out with your fingers. It's just a little bit harder. And again, set those aside with the stock fender because you won't need them again for the Fender Eliminator. Once you got your fender off to the side, we'll split it in half and take the lights out of it. And start with some of the central fasteners on the underside. There's 1 Phillips head screw that holds these 2 like halves of the plastic shell together. There's also one 8mm nut that holds the reflector on, but also the two pieces of the fender together. You can settle that hardware aside, and to the extent you want to keep your fender to reinstall it later or just for storage, you can put a lot of this fender back together. So then there's 4mm Allen head bolts, socket head cap screws, hold your reflector brace on. And our demo bike doesn't have a license plate on it, but you're gonna have to take your license plate light off, or sorry, your license plate off as well, because it's gonna kind of hold the fender together. And then finally, there's gonna be two more 4mm Allen head bolts. Once you've got all those bolts out, you can essentially divorce or split the fender, and you'll notice that there's kind of a long coiled up wiring harness, but the turn signals are the only thing holding the fender together at this point. So grab the green turn signal connector. I think you can push on it. Sometimes you just pry up easier. And you can kind of take one side at a time. While we're here with wiring, let's go ahead and disconnect the license plate light, which is the red side. Yeah, for these, recommend just lifting up the tab. I don't have the finger strength to get them to pop by pushing. So take that harness, and we're going to actually use this. So don't chuck it. Now before we take the turn signals out, we're going to take the license plate out, and it's held, the license plate light out, and it's held by two Phillips head screws. Start with the one that's kind of, you're going to have to get a regular old Phillips screwdriver and kind of come in at an angle. And start with that one, because then the one that's easy to get is going to kind of help the license plate light hold on. So take the hard one to get out first. They're plastic thread cutting screws, so they're going to be kind of hard, difficult to get out the whole way out. And then the second one, you can either use a driver, or in any case it's much easier to get out. Keep these screws and thread out the license plate light with its screws. You can set that aside. The last bit's going to be to take out the turn signals, and they're 14mm nuts, but they're fairly well recessed down into that pocket. And so you kind of have two options, one of which, if you've got it, is a split socket. Some people call them crow's feet socket or crow's foot socket, 14mm. That allows this cable to essentially escape through the side. If you don't have that, which I expect many of you don't, go ahead and grab a 14mm deep socket, and as long as that connector fits through essentially the drive portion of the socket, you can feed the wire through, and then you're left with essentially needing to grab onto that socket. And at that point you can use needle nose or pliers or whatever you want to essentially loosen it. And once you get it off there's like a serrated lock washer down in there. It should be really easy to spin off by hand. Design, and then yeah, just rattle the turn signal out, and you're going to keep all that hardware. So set it aside with the turn signal and do it again. And if you do have a shell socket, it does go a little faster, but you got to be real careful not to essentially cut it with the socket. So go very, very slowly when you're unwinding it. And then again, you can probably do the majority of it by hand. Okay. Thread all that up. And at that point, what you've got are your two turn signals with their hardware, the license plate light with its two screws, and we'll get to assembling the fender eliminator. Alright, at this point we're ready to start the installation of all the lights into the fender eliminator, and so there's a couple things we might as well do while we're here, one of which is install the 2 rubber bumpers into the license plate frame or flange. That's just going to keep the license plate from kind of rattling as your motor vibrates. Second one is going to be install the zip tie mount through the top, so push down through the top. That's going to open up a little essentially passage for a zip tie to pass through and allow us to grab all the wiring. With that, let's start with assembling the lights into the fender eliminator, and we're going to start with the license plate light. So feed that through, and then we're going to take the factory Phillips head screws and reuse those for installing the light. And since these just bottom out into plastic, you do need to be a little careful in terms of tightening them too much. I would certainly, if you use a driver, I recommend finishing them off with just a regular old screwdriver so that you don't risk over tightening and breaking the light. Before you tighten everything, you may there's a little bit of wiggle room in the bolt holes. So make sure you, just by eye, the license plate light is nice and straight, and then hand tight these bolts. Moving on, we're going to go into the turn signals, and so you start with so just to be clear, the gray 2-pin connector is the right turn signal. Looking at from the back of the motorcycle, the left is the green. So start by feeding the connector through the bigger of the 2 holes. Realistically, the turn signal has a 10mm thread with kind of like a boss on it, like a shank, so it's a little bigger than 10mm, and then it's got a little rubber nub, and that's your key. And so turn signal wiring goes through the big hole, and the nub will help key it to the right angle. When you flip it over, you'll see how we'll tighten everything up, and we'll reuse the whole washer stack. So that's going to be flat washer, serrated washer, and then hex nut. Threads all over the factory method. Spin this around. And you're going to need a 14mm open end wrench, a crescent wrench essentially, to finish tightening that. So make sure that that little nub part is in, otherwise it's well seated. Grab your 14mm wrench and finish tightening, again just by, you'll feel it once it all bottoms out, and there's really no benefit in going super tight, but you will take advantage of that lock washer on there. So hand tight on that, and then we'll move on to the other side. So the left side is green, thread through, put your washer stack and your hex nut through, and then get the boss, the keying boss in. If you tighten that without getting the boss in, you will potentially squish that little rubber. And what you should see is that the lights are tilted at the same angle. Again, tighten by hand. Once all the lights are in, all you got to do is feed the electrical connectors through that oval hole in the fender eliminator. You're going to have a lot of extra cables because of how long the factory fender is on the Duke 390. So kind of pull them all through, then we'll flip it on over, and part of the kit we provide a new rubber grommet, and the only one that's kind of critical or short run is the license plate light. You can either take this little tag and leave it or cut it off on the factory harness. But one by one, feed your cables through. It shouldn't actually be, since these connectors are really small, it's not going to be very challenging thing to do, so feed your cable through one at a time. And then all you really do is kind of squish your grommet into one side of the slot and kind of feed it in bit by bit. Really just pushing it in. And then when you flip it over, what you don't necessarily want is a whole bunch of like tangled cables. So the only one that's a little, again, yeah, it's like right at the kind of critical part of its length is the turn signal one. So you just got to make sure that that one is sticking up enough to get the connection on it. So as kind of mentioned earlier, with the kit we provide a zip tie mount and a zip tie, such that you feed the zip tie mount through the zip tie, or excuse me, feed the zip tie through the mount. Once you're kind of pleased with how all the cables are running through, and then you can, and again, this is going to pull the cable, so you don't want it to be like a straight shot into the grommet. You want to make sure each of the cables have a little bit of strain relief, and then you can snug that up. And then once you've got your zip tie tight so that, yeah, you can't readily kind of pull the harness through, take a pair of flush cutters and trim your zip tie. Okay, in prep for putting this on the motorcycle, you're going to take the 4 aluminum spacers that were provided with the kit and just put one each on each of the studs on the Fender Eliminator. All that's really going to do is give you the appropriate spacing, such that wiring is run cleanly, there's no interference with tail light, things like that. So it's important to put those 4 aluminum spacers on, and when this goes up onto the tail section of the motorcycle, we're going to use the 4 supplied flange locking nuts, the M6 K-locks, and they're going to thread down. So realistically, as you go to the bike, at least have one nut in your other hand such that you can hold the Fender Eliminator on. I would suggest going for one of the 2 rearward studs, because these 2 are going to be a little bit harder to get nuts on initially. So to install the Fender Eliminator, again, you've got your spacers already on your studs. Just start with your 2 turn signal connectors. Those are obviously the really long, kind of ungainly ones. Feed them through the big hole that's left by the factory fender being taken off. And then by eye, just line up the 4 studs with the 4 holes. Should line up perfectly. Make sure, yeah, your cabling is out of the way. And like I said, just put one so nothing falls apart. Spin down by hand. You should be able to take it all the way down to the conical lock washer engages, and then you can take your hands off. At that point, yeah, go ahead one by one and put on the rest of your fasteners by hand. These ones are going to be a lot easier to get to. Same kind of thing with taking everything off. Let me get my magnet out of the way. Obviously, once you get the nuts started, that's by far the hardest part. So again, yeah, I'll use the magnet tool just to make this easy, but if you don't have access to that, you just gotta be patient getting the flange locking nuts on. Before you go tightening any of the bolts, you see there's ever so slightly a little bit of jiggle, and so realistically there should be some very nice fitment to the tail light and to the body lines of the motorcycle. So just make sure everything's kind of symmetric, and then you can by hand, nothing crazy, you'll feel the conical locks tighten, and then it'll get firm because you're essentially tightening metal to metal to metal. There's no squeezing plastic here. So your lock washers will go all the way flat, and you'll feel that bottom out. So it should be an extremely rigid connection. But again, there's not a lot of mass here, so there's no need to go crazy tight. But they are M6s, so tighten to hand, you'll feel them snug up. Once you got all the bolts tight, take your rubber plugs that cover up the holes in the subframe and reuse them. So that's going to essentially go right back to how they look from the factory. And again, yeah, if you take the rider seat out, which is easy and I recommend, you can get an extra hand in here to help the installation of that. All that's left now is cable management. So out of the factory fender came this essentially adapter harness, and again, yeah, we're going to have a lot of extra that we'll take care of with a service loop and another zip tie also provided. But start the kind of whole process by plugging in the 4-pin. It's keyed, so it can only go in one way, and then it's going to be largely defined by that the license plate light short run. And so what I would do is get your turn signals connected, and then you can go essentially down with this to the license plate light. And so everything's connected at that point, and now we're just going to make a nice big service loop. So what I'd recommend from a service loop standpoint is take your adapter harness and you can kind of pull that out to the side and essentially half it. You can do the same thing with the right and left turn signal leads. So if all the connectors are kind of on your right side without straining their exits, you end up with a big bundle of wiring. You can either just zip tie that and tuck it under, or you can essentially fold all that wiring in half and run your zip tie around that. And this you don't need to make really tight, and you really want to avoid straining your connectors by like pulling cable over. But realistically, if you end up with a pretty snug but not like cranked zip tie, you can trim that and essentially tuck it under the subframe. There's a couple electrical connectors that are really just going to do the rest of the job holding that in place. Alright, obviously to get everything back to ready to ride, start with the primary rider seat, which is essentially kind of get the front tooth in and then shake it forward until the grommets fit on their bosses. And then the passenger seat, which has to slide through that strap, and it has a little catch on the very end that you must gotta grab. Ready to go. A quick note on license plate hardware, license plate mounting hardware. So we're going to give you a couple extra M6 lock nuts, and you can, I think, nice hardware that comes with the bike is the two 4mm Allen head bolts that hold on the reflector bar, which if you needed to, you could run up underneath your license plate light. If you don't need to run those, you can just reuse that hardware to mount your license plate light, or license plate, excuse me, and then just use the supplied lock nuts in the kit. Just because the factory fender has inserts that we're not going to reuse. Alright, on that note, the installation process is complete. I recommend you do a systems check for all your lights to make sure all the wiring was done correctly. Couple walk around views here just to kind of show just how tight the fit and finish to the factory bodywork and tail light are on this Fender Eliminator, and how kind of cleanly integrated it is to the underside of the motorcycle. Thank you for watching. Our products can be found on our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com. Thank you.